In 1858, a 7-year-old girl named Harriet Carr died in her bedroom in County Durham, England. The doctors who examined her could not agree on a cause. She had presented with vomiting, muscle weakness, and a progressive neurological deterioration that left her unable to walk in the weeks before her death. Her parents were wealthy. Their home was well maintained. The water was clean. The food was uncontaminated. The bedroom was beautiful. The walls were covered in a rich, fashionable green wallpaper, the kind that had been appearing in the finest homes across England for the past 2 decades. The kind that interior design publications called the pinnacle of Victorian domestic elegance. The kind that the wealthiest families in the country competed to display as evidence of their taste and prosperity. Nobody looked at the wallpaper. Nobody looked at it because the idea that a wall decoration could kill a child in her own bedroom was, in 1858, the kind of suggestion that would have made a physician question your sanity. It would take another 30 years, the death of a reigning head of state, and one of the most furious commercial cover-ups in the history of the decorating industry, before the world finally understood what was happening inside those beautiful rooms. And when the truth emerged, it would reveal something far darker than a manufacturing accident. It would reveal that the people selling the wallpaper already knew. To understand how wallpaper became one of the Victorian era's most elegant killers, you have to understand what wallpaper meant in the 19th century. It was not decoration in the casual, modern sense. It was a statement of civilizational arrival. Before mass production made wallpaper accessible to the middle classes in the early 1800s, decorated walls were the exclusive province of the genuinely wealthy. Hand-painted silk panels from China, hand-blocked papers from France, elaborate tapestries that took skilled weavers months to produce and cost more than most people earned in a year. To have decorated walls was to announce without saying a word that you had reached a level of prosperity where beauty was something you could afford to think about. The Industrial Revolution changed the economics of wallpaper production with the same force it changed everything else. Machine printing reduced costs. New synthetic dyes produced colors of a vividness that hand production had never achieved. And one color in particular, a green so saturated, so luminous, so unlike anything previously available in the palette of domestic decoration, became the defining aesthetic obsession of the Victorian interior. It was called Scheele's green. Named after the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who developed it in 1775, it was produced using a compound that made the color chemically stable, extraordinarily vivid, and deeply, permanently fashionable. That compound was copper arsenite, arsenic, stabilized in pigment form, pressed into the paper covering the walls of nurseries, bedrooms, dining rooms, and drawing rooms across the wealthiest homes in England. And the Victorians could not get enough of it. Here is the scale of what was happening, and why the scale matters. By the 1850s, an estimated 100 million square yards of arsenic pigmented wallpaper had been produced and installed in British homes. 100 million square yards. Enough to cover an area larger than the entire city of London, spread across the walls of drawing rooms and nurseries and bedrooms, where families spent the majority of their lives, sleeping, eating, nursing infants, recovering from illness, in rooms slowly exhaling poison through their walls. Because here's what nobody understood in 1850 about arsenic in wallpaper, and what a scientist named Gozio would not fully explain until 1892. Arsenic pigment, when exposed to damp conditions and a common household mold called Scopulariopsis brevicalis, undergoes a chemical transformation. The mold digests the arsenic compound in the wallpaper and releases it as a gas, trimethylarsine, that is invisible, odorless, and in sufficient concentrations, neurologically catastrophic. Victorian homes were damp by modern standards. Victorian heating, coal fires in individual rooms, created cycles of condensation on cold walls. Victorian ventilation was poor. The conditions required to turn decorative wallpaper into a slow-release gas chamber existed in virtually every room where the wallpaper was installed. The symptoms of chronic low-level arsenic poisoning are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves as poisoning. They present as fatigue, as digestive complaints, as a vague, persistent unwellness that Victorian physicians diagnosed, with complete sincerity, as gastric fever or constitutional weakness, or, in the case of women and children who spent the most time indoors, in the most decorated rooms, as simple feminine fragility, fragile constitutions. In rooms the color of money and poison, smelling of nothing at all, the deaths accumulated, the diagnoses missed, and all the while, the wallpaper industry was producing more of it. But something was shifting, because not everyone was missing the connection. As early as 1839, a German chemist named Leopold Gmelin had noted the distinctive garlic-like odor produced by arsenic compounds in certain damp conditions, and raised the possibility that wallpaper pigments might be releasing toxic vapors. He was ignored. In 1857, a physician named Dr. Thomas Orton published a paper directly linking the illness patterns he had observed in patients to arsenic-pigmented wallpaper in their homes. He documented specific cases. He named the pigment. He called for its removal from domestic use. He was dismissed as an alarmist. The wallpaper industry, faced with early scientific challenges to the safety of its most profitable product, responded with a strategy that will be familiar to anyone who has followed the history of the tobacco industry a century later. They denied. They deflected. They commissioned their own experts. Industry representatives argued publicly that the arsenic in wallpaper was chemically bound and could not be released in gaseous form. They argued that the quantities involved were too small to cause harm. They argued that the physicians raising concerns were misattributing illness from other causes to a fashionable and convenient target. They argued, in other words, that the science was wrong. And for decades, in the absence of a definitive counterproof, enough people believed them to keep the industry running at full production. The cover-up did not break because of a crusading scientist. It broke because of a death the industry could not spin its way around. Napoleon Bonaparte died on the island of St. Helena in 1821. The official cause was stomach cancer. For over a century and a half, that was the accepted medical history. Then, in 1961, a Swedish toxicologist named Sten Forsjövud published an analysis of Napoleon's hair samples, preserved since his death, as was the custom of the era, and found arsenic concentrations approximately 13 times higher than the normal background level. Napoleon had been living in a damp island climate. His bedroom at Longwood House on St. Helena was decorated with green wallpaper. The wallpaper was tested. It contained Scheele's green. The theory that Napoleon had been slowly poisoned, not by an enemy agent, not by deliberate assassination, but by the arsenic vapor rising off his own bedroom walls, became one of the most studied forensic historical cases of the 20th century. Subsequent hair analyses confirmed the elevated arsenic levels across multiple samples taken at different points in Napoleon's final years, ruling out a single acute poisoning event and pointing instead to chronic, prolonged exposure. The kind of exposure consistent with spending years sleeping in a damp room with arsenical wallpaper. The most famous military commander in modern history, defeated not by Wellington at Waterloo, not by the Russian winter, not by the coalition of every European power aligned against him, possibly by his wallpaper. By the 1880s, the scientific consensus had shifted beyond the industry's ability to suppress it. Gossio's work on the mold-to-gas conversion mechanism, published in the early 1890s, provided the precise chemical explanation that earlier researchers had lacked. The chain was now complete and documented. Arsenic pigment, household damp, common mold, toxic gas, human neurological damage. The wallpaper industry did not immediately cease production. It transitioned. Manufacturers began producing arsenic-free wallpapers, a marketing category that would not have needed to exist if the industry had not spent 40 years insisting there was no problem. The phrase arsenic-free appearing on a product label is, in itself, a confession. William Morris, the most celebrated wallpaper designer of the Victorian era, whose intricate botanical patterns are still reproduced and sold today, whose work defined the aesthetic of an entire generation of English domestic interiors, used arsenic-based pigments throughout his most famous designs. His family owned a copper arsenite mine. He dismissed concerns about arsenic in wallpaper as sham, and refused to accept that his papers posed any danger to the people living with them on their walls. Some of those papers are still hanging in historic houses across England. The people who live and work in those buildings are monitored. There is a particular kind of danger that the Victorians understood better than they are usually given credit for. The danger that arrives dressed as beauty, that announces itself through the very things a culture values most. The green they chose was not an accident. It was the most vivid, the most stable, the most fashionable color available at the moment industrial production made it accessible to an entire social class hungry to display what prosperity looked like. They wanted that green the way every generation wants the things that signal arrival, that say, without words, that you have made it, that your home is evidence of your success, that the walls around you reflect the life you have built. They got the green, and the green got them. Harriet Carr, the 7-year-old girl who died in her beautiful bedroom in County Durham in 1858, was not killed by poverty, or by contaminated water, or by any of the diseases that the Victorian era produced in abundance for those without resources. She was killed by the wallpaper her parents chose because they could afford it, because it was fashionable, because it was the color of the world they wanted to live in. The wallpaper in your home today is tested, regulated, and manufactured under safety standards that did not exist for most of human history. The paints on your walls are screened for compounds that the Victorians pasted directly onto nursery walls and called beautiful. You live inside the lesson they learned the hard way. The next time you choose a color for a room, the next time you stand in a paint shop holding 2 shades of green up to the light, deciding which one is more you, remember that the most dangerous room in Victorian England was not the factory floor, not the coal mine, not the street. It was the bedroom, and it was green.